I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. For years, gambling advertising has spread far beyond the ad break, becoming a familiar part of how Australians watch sport, follow news about sport, and spend time online. 3 years after the Murphy Review called for a comprehensive ban, the Albanese government has finally responded. But the government's plan to rein in online gambling advertising has drawn sharp criticism, with campaigners and crossbenchers arguing it falls well short of what was recommended. And in that gap, a bigger fight has opened up about how deeply betting has worked its way into Australian media and Australians' lives. Today, Crikey media reporter Daany Saeed on the government's plan to reduce gambling ads and why its long-awaited response is already under fire. It's Friday, April 17. Daany, gambling ads are everywhere. It's impossible to listen to a sports podcast in Australia that isn't sponsored by a sports betting company. But it's not just sports podcasts. A lot of other podcasts and videos on YouTube serve an absurd amount of gambling ads.
Popular multis or build your own, combining player markets like total goals, disposals.
Even Carl Stefanovic's new YouTube show is sponsored by a sports betting company. Being a man that may well fit into the target demographic for this, I'm sure you've noticed the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. It kind of blows my mind a little bit that even people who I've spoken to in the gambling industry who make their living off of this, who are absolutely incentivised in the most literal sense to continue the bombardment of gambling ads that we do have come out and said, and gone on the record and said, okay, it's a bit much. And I can't think of a single other industry where we've reached a level of saturation where people employed by the industry say the advertising for their livelihood is a bit much. Vested interest is a powerful thing. It's extraordinary when you go too far.
So to address this torrent of gambling ads that we see on every screen we look at, just before the Easter break, the federal government finally announced its plan around gambling ad restrictions, something that advocates and campaigners have been waiting 3 years for.
We are getting the balance right, letting adults have a punt if they want to, but making sure that our children don't see betting ads everywhere they look.
So remind me and those listening to this, what was actually announced by the Albanese government on this front?
Yeah, so there's a couple of top-line reforms, and we're going to get a better idea of them sort of in the next sitting week. Conveniently, that'll also get overshadowed by the federal budget. But we're looking at a restriction on gambling advertising on broadcast television to no more than 3 ads an hour between 6am and 8:30pm.
We will ban all gambling ads on radio during school pickup and drop-off.
We're going to see a banning of gambling ads on online platforms unless you have a logged-in account over 18 and have the option to opt out of gambling advertising. So that sounds, it's a little bit in the weeds, and there's probably some bits and pieces to work through there and some moving parts there.
We will ban cross-promotion content that mixes commentary with odds. We'll end advertising on jerseys and jumpers and in stadiums, and we'll ban
but there was a report that came out in the last couple of days that said that NRL clubs will be allowed to sort of see out the duration of those deals. So these reforms are going to kick in from the 1st of January 2027. A lot of those gambling deals relating to uniforms and so on sort of extend beyond that, and they'll be allowed to sort of see those out.
So while it sounds like there's a fair bit going on with these reforms, it's still a pretty watered-down version of what Peter Murphy in her inquiry was recommending.
If the status quo on online gambling regulation, including but certainly not limited to advertising, was to continue, Australians will continue to lose more. More money, more relationships, more love of sport for the game rather than for the odds.
It's been really widely criticised. It's been criticised by all sides of politics, and noting that Peter Murphy's sort of committee that put this report together back in June 2023 was a bipartisan committee and had people from both sides of politics. But the Murphy report said that partial bans on advertising don't work. It's really clear about that. It cites a fair deal of research on that. We know that this is a partial ban. We know that the Murphy report called for a national regulator, and there's no mention of that. There might well still be a response to that, but this announcement so far doesn't mention it. There's also no mention of inducements. So things like bonus bets and bet returns, things that sort of keep gamblers or customers' money cycling through betting apps and betting platforms. Those were recommended to be outright banned by the Murphy report. There's no mention of that in this suite of reforms that the government's announced.
The fact that it's taken so long, Daany, and it's so watered down from what the Murphy review recommended, does that show how influential the gambling lobby is in Australia? I mean, just how hard has the campaigning against these reforms been?
It's been really, really hard. I think it does. That's the criticism that has been put to me by advocates, by MPs, by the crossbench, by members of the Labor Party, both sort of in the parliament and outside it, within the rank and file, that are pushing for reform. This has been a really consistent criticism that the government has a really close relationship with the gambling lobby, and not just the gambling lobby. There are other stakeholders too that the government has close relationships with that it doesn't want to jeopardise. So things like broadcasters that rely on the advertising revenue, things like the sporting codes themselves.
Broadcasters are hooked on this revenue now, aren't they?
Yes, broadcasters are hooked on this as well, and they've sort of flagged that there might be changes to revenue models and so on, or warned or threatened that there might be changes to staff or to revenue models or to programming. I think that's a bit of an empty threat. A lot of these broadcasters are doing very well for themselves, and as we speak, Peter V'landys, as the chair of the Rugby League Commission, has been giving quotes to the News Corp papers about the massive, multi-billion-dollar broadcast deal that he's ready to sign and has many, many suitors for. So cynically, I would say they'll do just fine.
You mentioned that there's been some voluntary action from some of the betting agencies, because during that long delay in the response to these proposed reforms, these recommendations, have the gambling companies built ways to potentially get around these bans and reach customers? Because it seems like, as you said, already most of the sports gambling companies have their own podcasts, their own content channels with subscribers and followers. Would those things be defined as advertisements in relation to these reforms?
We're not entirely clear on that yet. Like the short answer is yes, they'll probably try to get around them in some form. This is part of the reason why a partial ban doesn't work, and this is why experts say partial bans don't work, is because gambling companies find new and creative ways to get around them. The gambling companies have already lobbied really, really hard on this over the last 3 years. In August 2024, it was reported that the then Communications Minister, now the Attorney General, Michelle Rowland, had sort of met with a number of stakeholders, including the big wagering companies. And the proposal at the time was something to the effect of 2 gambling ads an hour. It was then reported in January that Anthony Albanese had come over the top and made a captain's call and vetoed gambling advertising reform before the 2025 election. Now we're in early 2026, or a year on from that election. We've seen a new minister, and the proposal now is 3 gambling ads. So it's an additional ad per hour on what gambling companies were sort of already exposed to. So there's a criticism that has come with this latest suite of reforms from gambling companies that, we weren't consulted on these changes. And the reality is the gambling companies have been consulted in quite some depth for a really significant period of time. So they're very aware of the machinations of this.
Coming up, how gambling has become part of Australian sport. Daany, these reforms are still yet to get through Parliament. The Greens and independents like David Pocock are unhappy with what's been announced. Is there any real chance that these reforms get strengthened from here?
See, this is, I think, really interesting. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is maybe. The coalition sort of very broadly support gambling advertising reform. It's not really clear where they sit on this current announcement, but it's worth bearing in mind. And again, this sort of highlights the absurdity of how long this government has taken, that they were outflanked to the left by Peter Dutton and Sportsbet. But Peter Dutton came out a long time ago, in 2023, I think it was December-ish, and came out and said, we're in support of gambling advertising reform. We think it's too much. The government could very well take coalition support for this set of reforms and take it through the Senate. But the Greens are really critical of the proposal as it stands. Now, if you get the Green support, you're more or less through. But they would want to see it significantly strengthened. The Green spokesperson on this, Sarah Hanson-Young, has called the government squibs on this suite of reforms. They really don't think it goes far enough.
Have some guts. Just like they complained and squealed about tobacco, they're squealing and complaining and excusing about gambling.
Likewise, David Pocock, one of the three independents in the upper house, he's been one of its most vocal critics.
The Albanese government has failed Australians when it comes to banning gambling advertising.
Lydia Thorpe, obviously an independent former Green, has previously called for a total ad ban, hasn't sort of said anything in detail yet. Jackie Lambie has consistently voted in favour of gambling advertising reform.
You'd rather take those donations than worry about the future of our kids. You should not be sitting in this place. You should not be a representative in Parliament. I'll say that right now. You are doing nothing but hurting our Australian kids and their families.
And then One Nation is a bit of a wild card in the sense you've got 4 senators, but many of them are actually just never in the Senate. So it's not super clear where One Nation stand at the moment.
The other thing I wanted to speak to you about, Daany, while we've got you, is Nick Foote, the AFL umpire. His employment with Sportsbet has recently come under the spotlight. And of course, there's no suggestion that Foote has done anything wrong. But it does feel like an example of how deeply ingrained gambling has become in sport.
Absolutely. There was a great analysis piece by the ABC's Carl Pollard, who's one of their digital sport editors, on this. And he makes the point that it is absurd. And the absurdity of it has sort of been highlighted now that this story has become a national issue. And NRL communities, people above the Barassi line, have sort of expressed to me, this is insane. How do you have an umpire who's also on the payroll of a gambling
nearly
company?
fell out of my chair when I heard that we had an umpire employed by a gambling agency.
The AFL's rationale is that he analyses racing. He doesn't do football. And obviously there are a number of integrity scandals over the years involving Brownlows, involving umpires and votes and so on. The AFL were previously comfortable with it. My understanding is they might be a little bit less comfortable now in AFL House. But whether that leads to any change is another thing. He's been reappointed for this weekend's game again between Gold Coast and Essendon. And it's also worth noting that AFL umpires aren't full-time professionals. So there is a necessity of umpires needing to earn a living wage by other means. It's been a long-term debate in the AFL about making umpires full-term professionals. And one of the things it would mitigate is situations like this and integrity concerns.
So finally, Daany, is this now bigger than a simple advertising debate? Is it really a question about whether Australian sport has become too culturally and commercially entangled with betting? And does it seem to you like Labor is trying to make gambling ads less visible without really addressing the harms that online gambling has on Australians?
Yes, I think this debate is one of, like, fundamentally when you sit down in the pub with a beer and you have this conversation with punters, they do see this as a debate around what gambling's relationship is like relative to sport. And we've sort of seen the effects of it going unregulated in the United States through sort of en masse deregulated sports betting over the last few years. And it has seen an explosion of revenue, B, of just a complete change in how sport is presented in the United States. And I would argue that most Australians don't necessarily want to see us go down that path. And this is, I think, the politics of it that Anthony Albanese has relied on for a really long time. And I don't think it hits the same anymore. Is he said, oh, well, I want to protect the right of Australians to have a punt. I endorse free choice for responsible adults. And no one's questioning that, of course. But I think that line must have had some sort of cut through in whatever focus group the Labor Party had for it. I wonder whether it will continue. I struggle with the idea that the current state of affairs can continue, and I suspect most Australians do as well.
Daany, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, mate.
Also in the news, the PM has warned that there will be consequences for our fuel supply after a massive blaze at one of only 2 Australian oil refineries. The Geelong refinery, which supplies 10% of the country's fuel, has temporarily slashed production of petrol, diesel and jet fuel. Workers were forced to flee from what's been described as a bloody big fireball. Fortunately, no one was hurt. And anti-protest laws brought in after the Bondi terror attack have been struck down by New South Wales' highest court in a major loss for the Minns government. The law, which effectively meant protesters could not march without risk of arrest, was challenged by 3 activist groups: the Black Caucus, Palestine Action Group and Jews Against the Occupation. The Court of Appeal found the Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, or PARD as it was known, infringed on protesters' constitutional right to freedom of communication on government and political matters. I'm Daniel James. Thanks for listening to 7am. We'll be back tomorrow.